Ya. Ok, buenas tardes. Voy a hablar en español, o por lo menos lo que parece español, y Terry entiende más o menos. Pero él va a hablar en inglés. Y cualquier cosa, pregunta. La labor mía aquí es como cuando uno va a los toros, el torero es él, y yo soy el ayudante, porque no ha estado nunca en Chile, y este es su primer viaje. Somos amigos hace muchos años. Lo conocí cuando yo llegué a Stanford en el año 76, saliendo de las prisiones de Chile, y fue fuera de ser un amigo, fue una persona muy cariñosa conmigo y mi familia. Y nunca sabíamos que después íbamos a trabajar juntos, íbamos a hacer cosas juntos. Y producto de eso salió ese libro que se llama Computación, que significó un giro en su trabajo también. Yo creo que a Terry lo consideraban como más inteligencia artificial dura, y era la esperanza del MIT, de Stanford, en esta historia. Sobre los dos tuvo mucha influencia Humberto Maturana. Creo que quede constancia de eso. En algún momento, la manera de pensar los sistemas biológicos y la cognición biológica iba a contrapelo contra la computación simbólica. Y ustedes le pueden preguntar más preguntas a él sobre eso en algún momento. Ahora, lo que yo quisiera que hiciéramos en esta charla, la vamos a orientar a la historia de Google por un momento. Yo creo que Google es una compañía muy importante, no solo por el volumen, sino que cambió la historia de las prácticas humanas. Si ustedes se acuerdan, antes de Google, ustedes usaban buscadores y usaban cosas como Yahoo. Y hoy día ya no se usa eso, porque cambió algo fundamental. Y eso tiene que ver con el trabajo que él hacía con Larry Page y Sergio Brin, que eran estudiantes de primer año de doctorado. Para los que no lo sepan, no lo saben, ellos nunca se recibieron de doctores. La máquina de invención los tomó y los llevó a otro lado. Entonces, para mí siempre es interesante ver cómo funciona la mente humana y cómo muchas de nuestras teorías de lo que es la creatividad, lo que es la creación de valor, y que son cosas que realmente no funcionan de otra manera. Y yo creo que el caso de Google es muy paradigmático en eso, muy diferente. Entonces, si tuviéramos que tener a los dos fundadores acá de Google, que no los tenemos, pero tenemos a Terry, que es el profesor en el cual esto apareció. Y en todos los libros aparece su historia. También fue parte del primer board de Google, de la patente de Google, así que he estado muy cerca de eso. Ahora, a mí no me interesa Google solo, sino me interesa el pensamiento sobre cómo esto surge. Actualmente nos encontramos los dos en otra edad de nuestras carreras y estamos escribiendo otro libro juntos que va a versar sobre diseño y pensamiento. Y llevamos mucho tiempo en esto, todavía no lo cojamos bien, pero estamos en eso. Entonces, yo quisiera que Terry les contara la historia de Google, no como una historia lineal de acontecimientos, sino de pensamiento y cómo esto ocurre. Okay, con eso le demos la bienvenida a Terry y él va a contar la historia. Así que muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes. Mucho gusto de estar con ustedes. Aprendí un poco de español, pero es el lenguaje de casa, no es el lenguaje de academia o ni de tecnología. Entonces no puedo hablar de tecnología y pensar las palabras al mismo tiempo. So I will talk in English, but I understand some. So what I understood from Fernando, I want to give you a little bit of the context, the background about Google, and why you can see it in a very different light if you understand the history of where things were coming from. So I look out here and I see a lot of students, and for many students, you've never known a world without the internet. Okay, when you first started to be old enough to read and to do things like that, the internet already existed. And it existed in a form which we now take for granted, which is a very broad and open platform for all kinds of material, all kinds of people, and huge, everything. That was not, I started using the ancestor, the grandfather or grandmother of the internet back in the 1960s. So that's more than 50 years ago. That was when they first started having nodes, they had connections. So the basic technology was in place, but it was a completely different space. It was being done for scientists, also the military sponsored it. It was being used for those kinds of scientific communication and computing that a few people in a few laboratories cared about. In fact, for many years, up until the 1980s, so the first 20 years of the internet, it was forbidden to do anything commercial. It was not allowed because it was government sponsored. So it was used really as a communication medium between those people, among those people who had a strong technological background and a technological interest. Then what happened in the around late 80s, beginning of 90s, is a shift in that focus. So although it gradually started off, even into the 90s, as being academic and technological, you began to have the beginnings, the glimmerings of it becoming a vehicle for communication in the society as a whole, in the economy as a whole. When Larry Page and Sergey Brin came to Stanford, the project that I was one of the leaders of and that they joined was called the Digital Libraries Project, Bibliotecas Digitales, right? And our idea was to make it easier for people to find information online. But what we were thinking of as information was in the mold of a library. It was scientific literature, it was law, it was medicine. It was those things which people put onto the network at somewhat high expense for a somewhat specialized audience. And that was our mindset, that was the culture, that was how we were thinking. And then the technical question we were addressing is how do you make it easier to cut across multiple databases, to provide better visualizations, and so on. So we, the professors, were not thinking of the future internet. Right? We were thinking of the current network of information sources. The students, of course, always see farther into the future than the professors. And they recognized that there was a new set of problems, a new problematic that grew out of the open internet, where it was no longer carefully chosen materials put there by serious professionals, but it was everything that anybody wanted to put there. Because when you tried to find something, you had no way of getting things that were really good or relevant. And I was one of the early users, as they were, of the first search engines. Alta Vista, some of you may have. How many of you ever used Alta Vista? Anybody? Oh, good, quite a few, okay? So it was there before Google. They were using it as an example, along with several others, Lycos and so on. And it used the traditional methods of information retrieval, which is to decide whether a document is good for a certain request that you make. You match what's inside the document with what's in the words. So if I ask for digital library, it looks to see if the word's digital, the word's library, and the other words related, so computer and books and so on. But the focus is on what is in the document and how does that match. Now the problem with that on the open internet, if I was doing a careful, say a search in a medical database, that was excellent. It worked. But on the open internet, and if I asked about some medical problem, I might get some student essay, I might get some person's complaints, I might get a good article. But the notion of relevance, of quality, could no longer be dealt with by what's in the document. Now, to take a different strand, both Larry and Sergey came from academic families. Their parents were professors, and they were students, PhD students, and they were very much aware of the use of citations in scientific literature. So I write an article, I have to satisfy the reviewers, mention those important articles that came before in the same area. So I have a bibliography, I have footnotes, there's a whole world of how you do citations. And then there were beginning to become citation indexes, which said, here is a listing of how many articles cite mine, or yours, or whatever. And that became a measure of importance. So the notion that your value or importance could be looked at in terms of how many other people cited you, how many other people said, look at that, has long been in the academic world. And they saw the possibility of taking these two worlds and bringing them together. The notion of citations from the academics and the open internet, which had everything from commerce to economy to sports, anything you could think about. What is a citation on the internet? It's not a formal footnote. It's a link. So they had the insight that if you look at the number of links pointing to some article, that's a measure of how many other people, because they had to put those links in, thought it was important. And that was a good measure of whether it's a better thing to give you without specifically asking. I mean, you also ask what's the content, but you don't focus just on the content. It becomes a social rather than an informational process. It's not about what it says directly, it's about who and how many people in the larger sphere are pointing to it. Now, this would have been completely impossible to do a few years earlier because the open internet with many links had not yet grown up. So they came along at this moment in the history of the computer and the computer internet when the kind of concept that came from academic linking could be applied technically, feasibly, to the world of everything on the internet. And that was the key insight. Now, a couple of things there. I mean, it wasn't easy technically, right? To actually search. There was, on the web, and this is, for those of you who are in computer technology, you've looked at hypertext, which preceded the web and so on. The web in particular did not keep track of who pointed to you, or who you were pointed from. So if I'm on a page, I can identify where it's pointing to, but if I'm on a page, I cannot identify who's pointing to it. It's not part of the structure. And in fact, that was part of the genius of the protocol, the HTTP protocol that Tim Berners-Lee developed, because it made the whole system orders of magnitude simpler and so on. But they had to go out and actually find and store all of these links. And this took a lot of computing, a lot of networking, a lot of just good engineering to do. But as I say, that engineering was possible and was useful in that context. I was going to say one other. Oh, yeah. Notice so far I haven't mentioned money. Okay, that is, in all of this work that they were doing, it was not thinking about what Google became, which was this tremendous engine for advertising. In fact, advertising, again, if you remember where it came from in the academic literature, in the academic world, advertising is considered somewhat bad, right? It's what you do if you can't say something serious, you just hand wave, you advertise, right? So in the early years, actually after Google had left Stanford, it was a company, it still was not tapping into this other idea, which also was developed in a number of places, of using the combination of search and advertising. That is, if you want to advertise shoes, the best time to do that is when I'm looking for shoes. And you could do that matching, which is very different from the whole previous world of online advertising, which still exists, which is you go looking for sports and it puts up Coca-Cola. Right? I mean, it might help might help them sell Coca-Cola, but that's very different than giving you what you want. So after the whole initial process of Google, this new dimension came in, which is tying search, which they had done, to an advertising method. And that turned out, as you all know, to be incredibly lucrative, incredibly developing of money, of income, of wealth. They didn't know that. I know for sure when you talk to them back when they were students, they would have said, we're going to do a fantastic search engine. It's going to be great. It's going to give everybody access to everything. And if you had said, are you going to make billions of dollars, they would have smiled and said, well, that would be nice, but it wasn't what they were thinking of. So I think it's a good illustration of how the phenomenon that Google is today wasn't the way that it was started. It was moved in that direction by what they were able to do, and then as the world around it made opportunities open, it took those opportunities in a very clever way and became now not just very wealthy, but also very much a part of our practices, our understanding. Right? There are so many things in the world, from restaurants to new people we meet to places we want to go, anything where we Google it. And that gives us a different thrownness, as you would say, phenomenologically, a different relationship than when information like that was only available by going to people or specialized sources. So we can trace the Google phenomenon from what they did early to what it became commercially to what it has become as part of the universal practices. And I think Fernando can say more, but this is a very good example of what happens in entrepreneurship in general. Right? That you have this series of moments in which opportunities are presented by the world around you that you can connect to what you're doing, and that creates a new kind of thinking.
Yeah, but when we say the world, people normally listen that it's a world that already exists. And here, some of this innovation that happens sometimes by accident or looking something else, they were working with you in libraries, no? And it begins to open a world different. And that's the part that, in my opinion, is the interesting thing with Google and other people. Like the world is never more the same. But you don't see that at the very beginning. And you told me that this is an anecdote that is a good to put out, that your university, these people asking permission to go to do Google thing outside, and the university give you were the advisor. How much time do you give them? 2 years, 1 year of permission to get out of the PhD program?
Well, the permission, if they wanted to come back, they only had 2 years if they wanted to come back.
Yeah, entonces, dos años. Entonces, en algún momento, si tú vas a estudiar un doctorado, lo que quieres es terminar tu doctorado y que lo que quieres es ser profesor de una buena universidad. Entonces, empezaron a buscar consejos y qué sé yo, y fueron a hablar con Terry. Terry, you give advice, no, that they should send the thing for a couple of $1 million.
Yes, so early on, they built the original Google search engine. It was working well. Everybody around them was using it because we could see just immediately that it gave better results. And they were going around trying to figure out how to turn it into a company. And my own view was, this is a very good piece of technology, wonderful, and you should probably find some big company like Microsoft who will buy it for a few $1 million. And what I always say is, I'm glad they took my technical advice and not my business advice.
Okay. Yeah, and you know the story is that these guys, they tried to sell it for this moment, and they didn't find, the first reaction of many people was another search machine. And after there was a guy that came a year after, this Gross is the name, this guy, Bill Gross. Yeah, and they offered $1 billion. You see, what happened in the mind that $1 billion was not interesting anymore? And they decided not to sell. And well, that's a story. For those people that don't know the story today, the companies worth more than $100 billion, and their personal fortune is $40 billion each one, something like that kind of number. Yeah, and for me, it's amazing. And I said, you know me, I believe that life is unpredictable and it's mysterious, and we, in whatever activity that we are, we need to get in that adventure, that open possibilities, some of them very dangerous, and sometimes they're very good. And that's the entrepreneur. That is very different than the control engineer. And in my opinion, if we are going to produce engineers that are entrepreneur, they need to change the paradigm in which the human mind is. And that's why I'm interested in this case and part of what we are writing. But we know that we can do the same thing with other people. You have other student of you that is the Hoffman, is the founder of LinkedIn, another story. He's different because he's an entrepreneur oriented to money, and he knows how to create marketing in certain kind of network. But he's not a guy that has the same adventure there. Now, I'm not saying that he's not important. I believe he's very talented. But each guy has a different background. In the case of Google, it was very important that their parents were teachers. And the teachers are interested in reputation. And if you are interested in reputation, you are interested in quotation. And consequent of this, they invent this machine for reference or for relevance. And I think that's that story. You want to say more, or you want to talk about the future now?
I'll be glad to answer questions about it. But
yeah, let us take questions now, and after we can talk a little bit about what we see for the future. Some of the questions are written that people told me that it's going to work that way. Okay, so some questions here. I'm going to start with the more friendly. Which is the additional name for other names that people think before to put the name Google?
Before the name Google? So when they started the project, they were thinking of it from a technical point of view, which is how do you capture what are called the backlinks? So if you think of a link, I have a web page, I link to you. The link from you back to me, which, as I said, is not there unless you go create it, is called a backlink. So the first thing they did is build an engine to go out and search the web and make a list of all the backlinks. So it would say, here are the pages that point to Terry's page. So they called it backrub. So it was called backrub, and I think that's the only name they had before they called it Google.
Yeah, who came with the name Google?
They did. I don't know if it was one of them or both of them, but
this is for you. It's in English. Then you can read it.
I can read it if I put on my glasses.
You can read it.
Okay, so it's two. I'll just read it. Nowadays, we have plenty of information available on the internet. A lot of it is trash, and a lot of it is a copy of another website. Do you think the quality of information was better before it turned into an open network? That's question one. Question two, as an academic tool, do you think internet is better now or before Google? So let me answer the second one, because that's much more simple. Information isn't of any use unless you can access it when it's relevant to you. So the internet before Google, you could argue that the overall average was higher quality, but the overall quantity was so much less, and the quantity of what you could find was even less, that it was a completely different kind of tool. It was a research tool if I was writing a paper and wanted to know what other papers on this topic, things like that. It wasn't a tool for somebody mentions the earthquake in 1910, I can find out what happened in the earthquake in 1910. So I think there's no question that search made a huge shift in the internet and how it was used. Now, go back to the other question. There is a tremendous amount of junk. There's a tremendous amount of repetition. we need tools to help with that and to recognize that finding something on the internet isn't understanding. It may be a first step toward understanding. The information itself isn't what we care about. We care about what we can do with it. And I think the way that we use search and the way that we use the internet tools can be much better or much worse. If you just, when we try to teach students, young students, don't just, if you have a question, go to the internet, do a quick search, take the first answer you find and write it down. There's a big question, is that the right information? Is it trustworthy? Is there better information? So we need to learn skills for that, just as in the old days we needed to learn library skills. They're different level, but it's a skill in how you use the information, not just a matter of can Google find it for you.
Yeah, okay. There are several questions here that are in the same arena. That you begin to already answer. I believe some of the questions are concerned with the notion of value. Why there is so much trash in the internet, in the question, in the electronic mail. But in my opinion, it's a question that it cannot be solved only thinking what happened in the computer network like data, in more what happened in the conversations, the human conversation like sense, and how the conversations like sense are connected with the conversation of data. Maybe you can say something about that and we can talk together.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So if we take a step back, what has the internet done? It's in the domain of communication and how many and how often we can communicate with other people. So many years ago, if I wanted to sell something, I had to go face to face and say to somebody, here's what I'm selling, would you buy it, and so on. Then we got newspaper advertising and so on. Now anybody at a very, very small cost can put something in my mailbox saying, here, buy this. That's what we call spam. All right? And the ability and velocity and cost of getting that to many, many people has shifted. So the practices shift with it. So now the things that are being sold to us could be honest, not honest, real, not real, whatever, we don't know. Because we're even with somebody face to face, we may not know, but at least we have a much better intuition, a much better way of getting a feel for it. So the fact that you are able to communicate so effectively and so broadly leads people to follow whatever things they want. There are some people who want to cheat you. There are some people who want to sell things. They may not want to cheat, but they want to sell a lot. There are some people who just like to talk. You all know somebody who, if you go and sit down with them, they won't stop talking about what's happening in their daily life. Well, now they can do that to 1,000 friends on Facebook. So everybody has different motives, different concerns that lead them to do things, and we have to learn as a society practices that take into account the fact they can do those on a different scale.
Yeah. Well, why you don't talk, Terry, a little bit about how your conception of language changed after working with me and we moved from what I will call the symbolic notion of information of language, in which language wasn't the symbol, that was the initial people that you were a student when you were at MIT. And now we move more to the social meaning and to the historical meaning and hermeneutical meaning. And I don't know if you want to speculate a bit about how that can have consequence for the future of the internet or the future of mankind. I am not talking internet really. Okay. I am the political guy here, supposed to be.
So let me do this in two parts. One is to talk about context. So again, when we're sitting face to face, I know who he is, where we are. There's a tremendous amount of context that then lets me understand what he means, even if it's not in the language. As we know, much of our understanding of people and situations is not what was said word by word, but how we interpret, how we understand, how we observe. The internet, this is not search per se, but the whole internet is a tool for losing context. I see a piece of writing, it shows up on my screen, I don't know who put it there, why, who are they like, what's going on, and so on. And I think language detached from context doesn't give us the same power to respond and understand to it in a way that we do when we're dealing with face-to-face, especially in the realm of commitment, right? I mean, if I say to you, I'll see you tomorrow, you know you can trust me, you can't. Something on the web, you have much less access to. Doesn't mean you can't have friends, real friends, I'm not talking Facebook friends, real friends and send emails and have that kind of connection, but the mass amount of communication has been removed from the person. It's been removed from a real network of trust, and I think that's one of the topics for thinking about the future of the internet is, given that we don't have the personal connections and trust that we evolved to have for thousands or millions of years in dealing with people, how do you function in a way that can still count on things without being able to know directly? And I think a tremendous amount of churning, I'll call it now, on things like Twitter and Facebook and so on, because that's missing. Because it becomes detached, it becomes uncommitted language. Just you say it, and you see what people say back, and it doesn't have any real grounding in your shared situation.
Well, this notion of commitment and language is very important. I think that what is happening in politics today in the world, if you look, most of the democratic government are having problem of trust. There are a lot of distrust, and I am sure that some is connected with the internet, what we call the social network, and partially with blogs. It's so easy to have negative assessment about someone, but you don't call that negative assessment, you call them truth. And people, any negative assessment is truth.
Information.
Yeah, but information like truth, and the journalists also sexually, because they do that, and they produce spikes of more, and everyone is listening to the last rumor 3 weeks after disappear, but in the long run, distrust happen. And what begins to happen for many people, they don't want to be connected anymore, or they don't want to know about that. But those people that are professional politicians or professional journalists have to be in that way. And that's increasing the negativity. And I believe that we need to do a work that is ethical and philosophical and linguistic to change that. And it's possible to do. And I believe that in the future, you can offer a machine that has filter of bullshit. And I know that you and me can design an anti-bullshit machine. Then it's and I say it like joke, but it's not a joke really, and maybe we can do something about that. There are questions here that are connected with this, and let me see. I read some of the questions. How do you see the internet in the next 50 years? 50. This is a modest request, and it's another question. How do you see internet in 20 years? Maybe you should answer the 20 years, not the 50 years. And after they said, will it be banned or will be still existing? And how they do design interfaces for the communication with the Internet of Things? I believe that's good questions that you can deal.
Okay. Whenever somebody says, well, what's the internet going to be in 50 years, it's always good to look back 50 and see what you thought then, which I now am old enough to do. And at that time, if you had asked technically, will there be an internet which has certain kinds of nodes and certain kinds of protocols and so on, you could have made a reasonable prediction, especially if you added in the fact that computers are getting faster, communication is getting faster. From the technical point of view, it was visible 50 years in the future. From a social point of view, if you had said, will people be doing the things they're doing today, it seemed crazy. Because that's not who was on the internet, that's not what it was built for. And I think the same is true now. If you say, what's the internet going to be like 50 years, I can make technical statements about the nature of networking, better security protocols, higher bandwidth, all those things. But if you say, what are people going to be doing? How are they going to be thinking? We don't have the tools, we don't have the ability to make those predictions for shifts in the culture, for shifts in practices, as opposed to the technical shifts. So part of it's 50, 20 years, whatever it was. The Internet of Things. So one of the trends, and going back to the technology, is that it's clear that, when we go back in history again, when I started, say 50 years ago, let's just roughly say, a computer was something that sat in a box in a desk or on a table or whatever, and you would walk up to it, you would use it, and you'd go away. So the notion of interacting with a computer was accessing this thing which was there for you to use. Okay, maybe you had to punch cards, it was more complex, but it was basically that. Today, computers have become much more personal. So I carry a computer in my pocket, and I always have to remind myself that the tremendously powerful, expensive computers that I used as a graduate student are nowhere near the power of this. They would appear tiny if you put them in a phone, right? Not physically, but I mean the computing capacity. So there's been this tremendous change, but more important than just the capacity is the mobility. The fact that it's always with me. It's mine, I can do things on it, I can put it away, it can ring. The shift from a tool that I use somewhere to a part of my personal equipment, I think has made a tremendous difference in how we use computing of all kinds, including Google. Right? We're sitting at dinner and somebody mentions something, I look it up. Right? That would never happen with a desktop machine. Right? So what's going to happen with the so-called Internet of Things? It's going to get smaller. I will now have computers that are monitoring my health. I'll have computers in my glasses, Google Glass, right? I'll have computers in every part of a physical environment monitoring the situation and so on. And I think that is going to continue to shift the practice of computing away from let me use some computer to an ongoing interpretation of the situation. Now, that has benefits, and it also is really cutting across a very major concern that's growing for what effect that has on people's autonomy and control over them. And I could use the word privacy, but I think privacy has somewhat of a particular color to it. But control, autonomy, I think are important words there. That is, how much is it possible, given the Internet of Things, given that everything from my heartbeat to what I'm saying is being put online, how does that affect my ability to control my own life? How does it affect the ability of governments, of corporations, of the mafia? There are many, many different social agents who could use that kind of information in ways that would be very damaging or restricting to me. And I think the future of the Internet of Things is going to be shaped by how that concern evolves. I can't tell you where exactly. I can't predict because I don't know. But I think if we look back from 50 years, we're going to say, oh, when they were doing these things 50 years ago, they vaguely knew there might be problems, but they didn't realize here's the big issues, here's the big things. And I think we may have a very different view on it then.
Okay. There are a lot of, how much time we have? 10 minutes? 5? Yes, okay. Well, we cannot read the whole questions. But I try to get the spirit of the questions. I think that the way that you answer the question is we need to go more to one question that someone asked here. They want to know why we are writing another book. And because the books have to do with questions. You don't write a book for telling a story that everyone has. You want to open a different story that there. And it's then I want to answer what I am doing in that area, and you complement or disagree with me or whatever. We fight a lot in ideas once in a while. My opinion is that the whole scene of the Internet has making the notion of knowledge obsolete. I believe knowledge before has to do a lot with collecting information and putting information together, and that is every day more trivial. less important. I believe a student like you now don't need professors in the way I need professors. You can use simulators, you can do many things. What you need is mentors. And a mentor is not the same like the teacher. It's a guy that is more giving you opening orientation, but the mentor knows that it's going to be like you were with the Google guy. So you were the professor, but they are the inventors, and they are the people that bring the new world. And the bringing a new world is not the same that knowledge it. And that's something that we need to include in our pedagogical theories. Open new worlds, like, and you know my book, Disclosing New Worlds, open the story. And that's the influence of Heidegger in my thinking. Then it's what we need. I said we need several things. We need skills. And skills are something that has to do with body behavior. And, architects have a skill, musicians have a skill, sport people have a skill. And a skill is always a performance in which you need to be aware of a context. It's not pure information. And I believe that today, part of the design still is about information. It's not about, that's why sometimes to be in the network is too tiring, because the context don't come well. Now, the context don't depend only on the information of the network, depend on the social context in which you are. And the other phenomenon is something that I call sensibilities. It's like you are aware of something that you can see in small detail how it's happening around, and particular what is happening in the emotional and meaningful space of people. And I see here in Chile this drama here that we are having a crisis of trust that I don't want to tell you too much because I want that you are happy this day. But we Chileans are looking at that, and everything that is said is changing the sensibility of people, and the sensibility is growing distrust and irrelevance. On the other hand, you cannot live without politics. You cannot live without institutions. Then sooner or later that will be forgotten or will be a permanent crisis like Argentina, for example, to say an example short. Then the question is how we deal with the phenomenon of human beings that need to produce meaning, not knowledge, and how they need to produce sensibility to others. That is not different than the question of care and ethics and story. We know that very well in families. When we are parents of teenagers, we know that we cannot be any more dictators. We need to be friends, coaches, helping. And I said we need a different conception of meaning and for me the crucial historical notion, the theoretical notion for dealing with that is conversations. We need to begin to understand what conversations are. Conversations are no matter of information and knowledge, are more matter of sharing the space of living together. That's for now, and I would like that you comment that. And
okay, I'll give a different discussion, but it's not opposed to that. It's a different context. So I find myself at Stanford in Silicon Valley teaching students, and many of the students there, their first question is, okay, how can I use these courses to invent the next great thing that's going to make millions or billions of dollars? Which isn't bad that they're entrepreneurial, but behind it there is an attitude which you might call technological optimistic imperialism, or I don't have a good name for it, but it says the world out there is presenting you with sets of technical problems. If you can solve those technical problems, everything will get better, and you'll get rich, and so on. And I think a lot of these questions that Fernando has just been mentioning about context and about meaning and about understanding what is going to happen beyond the technology you build is missing in a lot of that teaching and a lot of that discussion. And so one of my reasons to want to write on this topic is so that the people who are engaged in that can have a broader view, can have a better sensibility about how their technological work fits into the larger historical, social context, and therefore to do things that are actually better for people and more effective.
Okay, I see that we are ready, Dean. We give thank you to Terry, and we finish because we need to go. They need to use the room for some other class.
I hope it's the piano.
Huh?
I hope it's for the piano.
Yeah?
Anyway.
Okay. We are ready? You want to say the last words?
Last words. No, I'll go back to Spanish for that. Right? Gracias para invitarme. Parece en una visita muy corta que la escuela aquí está pensando, está haciendo cosas muy en el mismo dirección, muy mismo lugar. See, I told you I can't speak Spanish. Right? Path, direction, but I know dirección is not direction. Anyway, that we have been thinking about. So it's very pleasing to be at a place where I think these kinds of ideas aren't just hitting a wall, but really are tapping into things that are already going on. And I'm very happy to see that.
Okay. Le damos un aplauso a Terry ahora, ¿no es cierto? Vamos.